So it seems rather remarkable that all these examples where refugees are allowed to return to their homes historically for as long as we have recorded history, but for some reason Palestinian refugees are excluded from that kind of right, that kind of inalienable right.
It was May of 1948. In The Hague, Holland, 2 former Nazis were sentenced to death for their participation in the slaughter of 6 million Jews. James Michener and Tennessee Williams were awarded the Pulitzer Prize. The United States had exploded an atomic bomb in the South Pacific. Joe DiMaggio hit 3 consecutive home runs, and the 35-year British mandate over Palestine expired, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel. For Israelis, 1948 was a triumph in their quest for a safe haven from the centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. But for the Palestinians they displaced, this event is known as Nakba, or the Catastrophe. In America and Europe, popular sympathy for a Jewish state had been growing, and when David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, he knew that he had the backing of many governments, including the Soviet Union. But Israel's claim to sovereignty was immediately challenged by the surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and within 24 hours the ongoing border skirmishes became a full-scale war. The battle was hard-fought in some areas, such as Lod, but the Arab armies were no match for the Israelis. The Jewish militia, the Haganah, quickly defeated the various Arab forces that stood in their way as thousands of terrified Palestinians fled their villages or were forcibly removed by the advancing Israelis. In some villages, the inhabitants were rounded up and executed, and as word of these massacres spread, many more villagers began to leave in panic. Others simply left, believing that they would return to their homes when the fighting was over. Mitri Barghouti, who was 10 years old at the time, describes what happened to his family.
Jews came in and they have asked the people to give up. In other words, not fight. Because if they didn't fight, they would get the same treatment as they did in Lod. Lod, they were resisted the incursion, and they fought hard, but they end up getting massacred, of course, because they are no match to the Jewish people prepared for that war. And a group of people went to the Jews, rather, to say, okay, we'll give up, we're not going to fight, like a doctor and a mayor and a group of people. So finally I said, okay, you raise the flag and bring all the people into the church, a Catholic church. And it happens to be where I used to go in school, elementary school. Father Julio used to be, he's a monk. And he used to be my teacher as well. So they started calling everybody to go to church. They went to church. Then the Israeli man, a military man, stood out with Abuna Julio, with Father Julio, and he told the people, and I believe it was Ishaq Rabin. I'm not too sure, but I believe he was him. He says, okay, you go home, carry what you can with your hand, and stand on the street early in the morning, because the buses are going to take you east to go to Jordan. And everybody went home. They put 2 or 3 clothes of changes on their body, because they couldn't carry everything. Some people carried water, some people carried food. My mother used to have twins, 10 days old twins. One of them is still alive, The other one died 10 days later. Then they put everybody on buses and trucks and carts and everything, and they drove them as far as they could east to go to Jordan. And I said, that's the way, go east. And some people who could walk, they walked in 2 days, they were there. But some people, like my mother at the time with a twin, 10 days old twin, they couldn't walk fast enough. So it took them a week before they got there.
But what caused a land where people of many ethnicities had lived in relative harmony for centuries to become divided in violence, a violence that persists to this day? To answer this question, we must first examine the history of the region up to the United Nations plan for the partition of Palestine in 1947. From the 1st century, current era onward, Palestine, particularly the area known as the Holy Land, has been under one foreign occupation after another. Jews, Christians, and Muslims made up the indigenous population. With the spread of Islam, Muslim Arabs predominated. Meanwhile, after centuries of persecution, a nationalist movement arose among the Jewish communities in Europe and in Russia. The ambition of this group, who called themselves Zionists, was to redeem the land of Palestine as the inalienable possession of the Jewish people. And in 1882, the first contingent of 25,000 Zionist settlers arrived in Palestine with the assistance of the French. In the first decade of the 20th century, with a world war brewing in Europe and Asia Minor, 40,000 more Jewish immigrants joined the ranks of the Zionist settlers. During the war, the Turks were driven out of Palestine by the British and their Arab allies, and in 1916 the area was divided into provinces under British and French control. A year later, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. It proposed a Jewish homeland in Palestine, under a British administration. However, the idea was opposed by the First Palestinian National Congress in 1917, as well as many prominent Jewish leaders in Europe who predicted that much trouble could come from such a venture. But why shouldn't Jews have a homeland? Dr. Jess Ganan explains the difficulties.
It's a very good question. It's a very complex question. And if you look at the way the question is asked, it says, why shouldn't Jews have a homeland? It doesn't say, why should Jews have a state? And, you know, given that we live in the 21st century and we're coming out of the 20th century, it should be really obvious that Jews do have many homelands, just as Christians have many homelands, just as Muslims have many homelands. And that the idea that there should be privileged homeland for one religious group over another religious group really smacks of racism. And that, you know, in this era, in the modern era, the way we're kind of confronting, you know, what the world is presenting right now in terms of war, social injustice, bigotry, hatred, and racism, we can no longer tolerate a kind of ideology or a kind of racism that says that one kind of group, whether it be based on religious or other kinds of perspectives, is privileged over another group. So I would say, you know, it's clear that Muslims, that Christians, and Jews have many kinds of homelands, and it should be guaranteed. And in fact, if you look at the current demography of the distribution of Jews, Christians, and Muslims all over the world, people are distributed, they live, they work, they function all over the world. When you start talking about a privileged, a special place for one religious group over another, based on some sort of religious ideology, again, that smacks of a certain kind of racism, which we cannot tolerate anymore. And that's why the concept of a state, so to speak, for one religious group exclusively over another cannot be tolerated in the modern era, or in any era for that matter.
The colonization of Palestine continued after the war. From 1919 to 1923, another 35,000 Jewish immigrants came to the region, increasing their population to 12%. The conditions now existed for two competing nationalist aspirations under the rule of a foreign power.